Hello and welcome to another Jobava London game. So I've shown a lot of games where the Jobava wins. So today we're going to have a game with the best player in the world, Magnus Carlsen, squeezing the Jobava London, and showing what can happen if you get into trouble. The Jobava London can't win every time, so I thought I'd show an example of what happens when the Jobava London gets in trouble. So, a 2024 game. It happened early in the year, January, and let's go here. All right. The white player, Suyarov. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly. 28-35 rated versus 32-88. Magnus Carlsen. Let's see how the best player in the world handles the task of facing the Jobava London. So knight to f6 here, a standard move, and knight to c3, indicating that white may want to play the Jobava London. So d5, helping control this e4 square, preventing e4 by white, placing both pawns in the center. So the game continues with bishop to f4, the Jobava London. So this is the Jobava London setup. And what does Magnus do now? Well, he plays this a6 move, which is important because it keeps the knight from being able to jump to b5 in the future. And, along with the bishop, target this c7 pawn. So right away, Magnus stops any play with this knight jumping forward. But let's see how he starts to squeeze the Jobava London. So e3, common move, protecting the bishop, fortifying the pawn on d4, allowing white's bishop to develop. So now we have immediately a pawn move by Magnus Carlsen. So he plays b5, perhaps in the future pushing forward to b4, chasing this knight. So white just ignores that with a counterattack on the king side, pushing the h-pawn, gaining space. Magnus quietly plays this h6 move, perhaps waiting to see what the opponent will do, playing calmly and waiting. So bishop to d3, just developing, controlling e4, aiming at the king side. And now we have e6 by Magnus. So interesting. Magnus Carlsen has played 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pawn moves. His opponent has played 3, but has 3 pieces developed versus Magnus's 1, which, that's okay when the center is closed like this. You can be behind in development. Now, if the position was wide open, well, then it could be a lot more dangerous. All right, moving on. I had a viewer ask before about this knight on c3. What should you do with it? Well, sometimes the knight just stays here. Sometimes, if possible, it'll try to jump up to b5 or maybe a4 and then b6 sometimes, or guarding, from a4 it can guard c5 and, perhaps jump over here. But sometimes this knight will move to e2. Now this pawn can push forward, here fortifying the important d4 pawn. So what does Magnus do? He pushes his pawn forward. A common and important move by black against the Jobava London is to push that c pawn and put pressure on the important d4 pawn, which is kind of like an anchor in white's position. A lot of the play will revolve around this d4 pawn. White will try and control the dark squares on d4. This e3 pawn is helping fortify d4, but also c5 and e5. So The game continues with c3 fortifying the attacked pawn. Magnus starts developing pieces, as does his opponent, continuing developing this knight, which is now targeting the dark squares. So Magnus has developed his bishop to help fight for this dark square, and also attacks White's bishop. So we finally have some material being exchanged here, a pawn for a pawn. So now the game continues with the knight jumping up onto that dark square, which has been vacated by the pawn. So continuing that theme of White trying to dominate these dark squares. So if the knight is captured, well, then a pawn can recapture and put more pressure on the dark squares. What does Magnus do here? Well, he needs to get his pieces developed, complete development, figure out what to do with his king, his queen, and the rooks. So the bishop is developed first, helping guard this knight, which is under attack. So the opponent, Magnus's opponent, playing the best player in the world, he tries to exchange off some pieces. So, I probably should have the analysis on the whole time while we're playing this. I apologize that I did not put that on. So let's see. I guess I could turn it on now, and it jumped me back to the beginning. So I apologize for that, but let's zip through those moves again. And before we do, we see that Magnus played at a 93.7 accuracy rating versus 83.1 by his opponent. And his opponent did have a blunder. So let's see how Magnus kept the game even until he gained an advantage and drove the win home. So analysis. All right, we'll blast through these moves again real quick. D4, knight to F6. So they just develop. We have the Jobava London, and Magnus starts bringing out all his pawns here, while White is mostly developing pieces. All right, and then we had the build up here on D4. So knight to F3, fortifying D4, and now an exchange with these pawns. So the bishop recaptures, the knight jumps into the center. So another good example of once that knight lands, the knight that was on C3 retreated back to E2. Sometimes if the bishops are exchanged, it could jump forward, but here it chooses to centralize and attack this unprotected knight. So at this point, White is still ahead by plus 0.33, it looks like. And the game continues with Magnus moving to B7 to protect this knight. The computer preferred bishop to D7, but from B7, the bishop kind of aims down through the center and towards the king side. All right, an exchange. So a lot of times a lower rated player will try and exchange off material thinking that, well, if I get rid of material, that's less that my higher rated opponent can attack me with, and it'll be closer to getting a draw. But let's see how it continues here. The knight is centralized, but apparently that's an inaccuracy, that it would have been better to jump to E5, which is a common or more common move for this knight to jump up to the E5 square. It could have targeted the bishop here. So after knight to E5, then it looks like bishop just back to B7. All right, moving on. We have the bishop retreating back. Apparently this is the best move. It keeps an eye on C6 and kind of aims down towards White's king side once this pawn moves. All right, continuing on. Bishop up to E7, maybe threatening to trade off more pieces. Magnus makes a mistake here, apparently. So computer likes H5 the best, keeping the space equal on the king side with the pawns here on H4 and H5. But Magnus decides to move to queen to B6, and the computer says that that's a mistake, and the game is plus 0.8, almost a pawn's worth of material because of that move. So, what is best for white? Apparently queen to f3, threatening to capture. And then if the queen was on f3, once the pawn recaptures, snap up a pawn. So let's see how it plays out here. We have queen to e2, so a miss by the opponent. And now the game swings back in Magnus's favor. So, the opponent overlooked that move of jumping here and putting more pressure on this knight. So the game continues with bishop to d6. And our opponent, Magnus's opponent, can be forgiven for overlooking that because they're playing a 3-minute game here. So, they're moving fairly quickly, trying to save time in case the endgame becomes difficult and complicated. All right, moving on. We have a knight retreat because this bishop is under attack. But apparently it would have been better to jump the f-pawn forward to protect here. All right. So we have knight launching forward here. Another mistake by Magnus. The computer prefers queen to c7. But, after this, and white missed another opportunity to capture this pawn. But perhaps white was afraid that Magnus could place his rook on an open file here, aiming at white's king side. Moving on. Exchange of bishops here. The queen recaptures and a pawn push. So what does Magnus do? He ignores that and castles. Computer says that's an inaccuracy, that it would have been better to just push the central pawn. But the game continues with a pawn thrust in the middle to e5, attacking the queen. And how does it continue? A retreat and the blunder here. So here we have a rook to h3 blunder move. Now, perhaps that move was played as a little joke, not the blunder part, but Magnus is, I don't know if he's famous for this, but often Magnus will do a similar type of move where he lifts his rook up and then swings it over, either to the center or to the other side of the board. Here the rook could move up and then maybe reposition to g3, attacking this knight and trying to get a line on the king. So let's see why this is a blunder. It looks like f6 would be the best move by Magnus. Does he find it? Yes, he finds that move, and let's see why this turns out to be the best move. Well, white captures instead of repositioning the rook as planned, and so we have pawn exchanges. This kind of helped Magnus develop his rook, castling queenside by white, and the pawns start pushing forward, preparing to squeeze white's position. So there's also this threat here, possibly, of forking the bishop and the knight. Okay, here we go. We have a retreat. The pawns push forward, squeezing the position. What does this knight do? Well, the knight does not move, and it's under attack. Instead, we have this counterattack here, threatening to capture this pawn with a fork of Magnus's king and rook. So what does Magnus do? Well, he ignores that and just captures the knight, attacking the queen. So we have a fork by the bishop, and then king to h8. And we see, the position is in favor. Magnus is pretty much winning now. So how does he bring this win home? Well, capture, attack on the queen, and now the queen just sidesteps. So Magnus presses forward here. So the option is to fork these two rooks, but the queen is guarding that pawn. So Magnus's opponent, maybe feels that, oh, this is covered, but Magnus does it anyway. And then this is where the game ends after 27 moves. So why? Well, the best option is to go ahead and capture, but that allows this bishop to swing down here and take the rook. So at this point, black would be ahead by +4. And, that's why his opponent, Magnus's opponent, resigned. It looks like white's best move might be h5. But then Magnus has these two rooks. So, he's just ahead by a lot of material here. What is the recommendation? Rook to d8, lining up on the bishop and the rook, and preparing to bring this other rook in. So now what? Queen to h4. The bishop is under attack. So this is how the game could have gone. But it would have just been a losing battle, especially facing the best player in the world. After this move, bishop to e4, and exchanges would occur, and Magnus is ahead in material. All right, well, please like and subscribe if you haven't already. Feel free to leave comments with anything you would like to say. Thank you for watching, and have a super chess day.